Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to Heartline Ministry. You've heard it said, surely your sin will find you out. We're going to see that today in chapter 7 of Esther.
Celebrating Christ our King, lifting up his holy banner, marching into the promised land. Chains of sin have now been broken, there is glory in this place, where the Joshua generation walking in his amazing grace, walking in his amazing grace.
Well, greetings once again. We want to thank you for tuning into Heartline Ministry. I'm Pastor Harold Noyes, pastor of the Community Christian Church. We're located on the Lower Road in Athens, Vermont. Alongside of me, my co-host, Pastor Timothy Golden, and they're located at Life on Main in Charlestown, New Hampshire. Tim, we've been going through this wonderful drama. I picture, just a wonderful drama of the book of Esther. And going through all that has been happening. Now we're in chapter 7. And, I have always loved this book. Mm-hmm. I just to watch and see how God orchestrates everything, puts everything into play, and then to see how he just works it all out. I think of that Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love him. Yep. To those who are called according to his purpose. And to read the book of Esther, we see that, in the life of Esther, in the life of Mordecai, and so forth. And eventually, of course, in the life of the Jewish people.
Exactly.
And so I just love this book. Mm-hmm. Just to put everybody up to speed as to what has happened in the first 6 chapters. The first chapter we have the king has got all the governors and princes together. He's talking about building up a coalition where they will help him finance as well as maybe sending in troops. He wanted to overtake Greeks. And, it did not fare well for him, unfortunately. And then, of course, he got all of them drinking and having a rowdy party. He had Queen Esther, or wanted to have Queen Vashti come and present herself before the other princes and governors. She refused. So the king, being the manly man that he was, wanted to find out, what should I do with her? And because all the other ones said, you got to get rid of her because it's going to be found out by our wives that she said no to you. And now we're going to go home, and the women are all going to say no to us, right? And we can't have that. So he disposes of Queen Vashti. Then he has another pageant, or he has a pageant where Esther comes in, and she has certainly found favor, brought great delight to the king over and above everybody else, and she was brought on. This probably was like a 4-year process. Because in between that time, the king had gone to war, and he came back with his tail between his legs because he got beat very badly. Esther becomes queen, and then now you have the whole setting, really not around Esther at this point. The whole setting kind of changes to Mordecai and Haman, Mordecai being her uncle, which, she was like an adopted daughter of his because she lost her parents. But it became, between Mordecai and Haman got all bent out of shape because everybody was bowing before him except Mordecai. He would not bow before him. And even in the midst of the vast crowd, he could see this one lone figure. And that drew him great indignation and wrath upon his heart. So he goes to the king and says, I want to write a decree. And the king, being the wonderful man that he was, took off his ring, handed it to Haman, says, whatever you write, stamp it with my ring, and that will be the decree.
With absolutely no knowledge of what people, just that there was a people that was rising
Yep.
up. So yeah, okay, whoever it is, go do what you want to do.
And do whatever you want to do. So he gave him absolute free reign. Unbeknownst to the king, of course, is that Mordecai and Esther were Jews. They have not let it known yet, or had not let it known yet. Mordecai now goes and explains or says that he's a Jew, which really brought the wrath of Haman down, because being an Agagite, they hated the Jews. So this is my chance now to extinguish the earth from all Jews. Now, this happened like on the first month of the year.
Right.
And they had until the last month of the year to fulfill this. There's going to be one day that they were going to have a bloodbath during the last month of the year. Now, Mordecai gets wind of this, goes to Esther, tells her what's to happen. She goes and asks them to do a fast and to pray. Now, in this whole book, I find it amazing, Tim, that God is not mentioned.
Right.
But certainly all through this book, God is implied.
Absolutely.
And that's what I love about it, is that you're able to see easily how God is applied here or implied here.
Yeah, and the implications we're talking about are because of the behaviors that he was doing throughout were they were Jewish responses to God himself,
Right.
to Yahweh. So, like I say, even though God wasn't mentioned, the behaviors that were exhibited were behaviors that were solely set aside for their worship and their prayer to God himself.
So Mordecai, when he hears about this decree, goes and puts on sackcloth, ashes, becomes like just absolutely, I don't know what word I want, where he's just humbled before God and pours out his heart to God. And he asks Esther to do the same, right? So, and she says that she would do it, her chambermaids would do it, and for 3 days.
Right, for fasting.
For fasting and things of that nature. So that's where we were. And now Esther has gone and told the king that she wanted to do 2 banquets. Both the king and Haman were the only ones invited to this banquet.
Yeah.
The first banquet, not very significant in my view, other than, you're going to come, and then tomorrow I'm going to have a much larger, lavish banquet.
It created anticipation within the heart of the king and Haman.
Yeah.
She really played their male egos and especially Haman's pride.
Yeah. And you can see, like in chapter 6, where Haman goes home and he brags about, I'm the only one that's been invited to the queen's palace. I'm the only one invited to this banquet. It's all about me. I'm going to be honored and all of that. The king goes to bed after the first banquet. Can't sleep. Calls his squire or someone to come and read to him. Just so happens, right? Coincidence. Just so happens that he picks up the chronicle of the book where Mordecai had saved the king's life, right? They were 2 guys were going to assassinate the king. Mordecai let Esther know about it, or let someone know about it, and they told the king and saved the king's life. The king had not rewarded him, which was a tradition in those days. So the king says, what have I done to Mordecai? Nothing, sir. Well, I'll find out what to do. Haman happened...
Because he can't make up his mind for himself on anything.
He just can't. He just can't. So it just so happens, right, coincidence again, Haman gets up early and comes into the palace early. Walks in, and the king gives him the situation. What would you do, Haman? Now, Haman thinks, oh, this is all about me.
Yeah, because he just referred to what would you do for a man that did X, Y, Z.
Right. He did not say it's for Mordecai. So, Haman thinking that, hey, he's the big cheese in this whole thing. Wow, I'm going to really live this up because this is for me. put on the royal robe, put on the royal crown, ride the royal king's horse, march him through the city, lead the horse, and all this, so that I'm second in command. I'm just up there with the king. However, Haman gets a big surprise. When the king says to him, I want you to do this for Mordecai.
Yep.
Wait a minute. I thought this was going to be for me. No, this is for Mordecai. So Haman had to eat his pride and do everything he said for Mordecai, which really brought out the ire of Haman even worse, I would think, because now he's embarrassed.
Yeah.
Well,
because the very one that he was demanding praise from, now he wasn't only parading him through the streets, he had to shout this guy's praises.
Yeah.
And so that, it was like taking it to the whole other extreme.
Yeah, so, and last week I think we looked at it this way. It's so amazing to me, the sense of humor that God showed. And, this is what you want, and this is a guy you hate. I'm going to make you do this to this man you hate, Mordecai.
Yeah.
And he did it. So, first banquet ends. Now we are in the second banquet. That is chapter 7, where we are at. We're going to open in prayer and ask the Lord to bless us as we do chapter 7. And then I'm going to have Pastor Tim read chapter 7 for us. So let me open in prayer, and then we'll have Pastor Tim read the chapter. Father, we thank you so much. Lord, what an amazing account this is. I don't even want to use the word story, because this happened. This is real. And Father, just the way you orchestrated everything, just the way you have worked out all things. And Father, just to see your hand in it, even though you weren't mentioned, it's easy for us, Father, to place you and see your working hand. So, Lord, bless Tim and I as we share chapter 7. Be with the listeners, Father. Open hearts, minds, lives to take in this great miracle and this great way in which you are going to protect your people. So, Father, we thank you so much in your name. Amen.
Amen. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided.
Wow, what an account. I mean, I just love this. Just the way that it is just so pronounced. And, to watch all this, or to see all this played out, from where we have gone, from chapter 1 in the banquet hall, and they're drinking and making merriment, and then Queen Vashti and so forth, and the whole way everything was all played out, just to see how God was going to protect his people.
Yep.
And to me, that's just
Yeah.
just an amazing picture.
And everything that Haman sought to use to advance himself actually led to his demise.
Yeah.
You know, from, as we will see in later chapters, the decree
Yep.
comes to nothing. Like you had said before, with the thought that he was going to exalt himself by being paraded through the streets on a horse, worked quite the contrary. The gallows that he had constructed for Mordecai's death now turned back on him as well. I mean, everything that he thought that he had so masterfully devised, which he apparently was a great master of because he had risen to the state of exaltation within
Right.
the king's ranks. And so he obviously was skilled in these things. But in the sight of God, his greatest skill was no match for God.
Right, right. You know, and like we I think we said last week, where we really had to do with, wait a minute, his God, and he plays all this out, lets it go to almost like crescendo of, wow, I'm really now somebody big, and God just kind of takes the rug up right out from underneath him and says, "Not so fast, my man. You know, this is what we're going to do." And to me, it's just
Yeah.
a picture of our sin will find us out. This is exactly what happened with Haman. And how many of us try to think that we can hide behind our sin or think that nobody will see it, nobody will know it. But we know one thing, God knows it.
That's it.
You know, I may be able to hide it from other people, but I can't hide it from God. He sees and knows all things. He knows my heart, just like he knew Haman's heart. Remember last week we talked about your pride cometh before the fall.
Yeah.
Well, certainly now we're seeing that come to fruition. You know, his is boastful Haman, thinking he's the greatest. And once again, I mean, maybe he had good reason to because of the way he rose up in the ranks, how quickly he rose up in the ranks, and all of that. But still, he thought that he was better than anybody else.
Yeah. And then you even have people like Queen Esther,
Right.
who actually had the opportunity to fall prey to the same attitudes and the same heart, in a sense, that Haman had when all this stuff was first mentioned via Mordecai to her, that this is what Haman is planning, and so you need to go to the king and you need to set the king straight. And she's like, but do you understand where you're asking me to put myself? It could be my life. I mean,
Right.
that is, wanting to seek to preserve self is an aspect of pride. It wasn't to the extreme that, you know, because we like to categorize things.
Right.
You know, we like to look at Haman and say, wow, look at how bad he was. But really, Esther had that opportunity to give into the same level of pride. But even Mordecai had made mention to her that don't think for a minute you're going to escape this.
Right, right.
Because, you know, it will come on you because you are a Jew. But then he made this mention that how her household will be affected if she doesn't take a stand, but how his household, even as an uncle, that his household would be okay, you know, and that God would still vindicate, God would still rise up a remnant from within, right? And so, but he made it very clear to her, look, you want to go down this path, it's not going to go well for you. But you were set aside for such a time as this, so that way God could be vindicated. Let yourself be among that number. And she chose wisely, and that's when she spoke up to have the fast happen and whatnot. I mean, her heart wasn't perverted, I think, like Haman's was, but that pride temptation was still there for her.
You know, but, you know, the way I'm looking at it, Tim, is this, and the only difference is Haman has been in the king's presence every day.
Yep.
Esther now, before she goes to him, has not been called to the king's presence for 30 days.
Right.
So therefore, I look at it as if she's looking and saying, maybe I've lost favor. You know, maybe I'm not quite his favorite anymore because it's been 30 days since I have been with my husband.
Right.
You know, so maybe this is how God was kind of keeping her more level-headed, if you will, because she's saying, hey, I could go to him, and where I have not seen him for 30 days, he could tip the scepter against me, and I could immediately lose my life.
Yep.
You know, it wasn't as if I had just spent the last week with him.
Right. And that's what I'm getting at. That, I mean, it's not the same kind of pride quite like what we see with Haman.
Right.
Haman's was a very perverted and very egocentrical type pride. Hers was more of a self-preservation, but it was still an element of pride, I think. You know, in a very small fragment, but the kind that we would all have. I mean,
Right.
that comes with our human nature. We want to protect ourselves.
Yep.
But it didn't take anything for her to swing, right? All Mordecai had to say was, boom, think this through, Esther, And when she, okay, yeah, you're absolutely right. And we all need that from
Right.
time to time in our lives, Even among those that are trying to walk very righteously with God, life happens, and it tends to get us a little fog-brained for a moment.
Yep.
And there's probably a little bit of that for her, but she quickly came back around.
Yeah, and once again, going back, I think it is to chapter 5, where, probably the words that are most quoted for the book of Esther, that you are here for such a time as this.
Mm-hmm.
We can't help but think about that.
Yes.
Esther was the right person at the right time, in the right place,
Yeah.
to do what was right.
Yeah. It's kind of like what we see through this whole story, through every individual that's involved. They didn't have the whole picture from the get-go,
Right.
but God let them move, and then God worked those things together for the good
Right.
of those, right? And so for them, it worked favorably. We don't, we're going to have you sign up for this pageant, not having a clue when they did that,
Right.
that maybe God had orchestrated that.
Yeah.
But the same token, we could look at that from the reverse standpoint with Haman. He didn't know, he thought he was going to have himself paraded.
Yep.
But God knew he'd think like that.
Right.
So, but this is going to be my way to exalt Mordecai. Oh, you think you're going to hang Haman? Yeah. Or you think you're going to hang Mordecai? Yeah, I got another plan.
Yeah.
So,
And once again, just going back a little bit before we get into chapter 7, I personally do not think that when Mordecai entered in Esther's name, that she thought she had a ghost of a chance.
no.
I just don't think so.
Well, you think of all the millions or
Yeah.
thousands that would have been part of that. It's like throwing your name in the lottery. Yeah, people buy lottery tickets because they want to win, but do they really think they're
Yeah,
going to?
right.
Probably not.
Yeah, and you see this, and yeah, right. You can throw my name in, but I don't have a ghost of a chance. I'm just a plain girl. I'm just whatever, that they say, and we find out that he actually stopped the pageant early because she had found such favor with him.
And not just him, but all that were involved.
Yeah.
Which was that right there is a miracle.
Yeah. They didn't have to spend all the time prepping her that they did all the other girls and all this other stuff. So you can just see God's hand, his handiwork, working it all out, formulating it, putting it all together, so that it would now come to this point. So now in chapter 7, we see this. The king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day. So this is now the second banquet. All right? Remember now, chapter 6 is the first banquet where it's almost like Esther is just prepping them for this second banquet. I personally think that maybe the second banquet was even more elaborate than the first. But kind of prepping for this time. I almost wonder, do you think maybe Esther was kind of trying to read the signs? What kind of a mood is the king in? What is his attitude? With the first banquet, now coming to the second one.
Well, we can definitely see she had her own level of strategy involved here. She understood how men think.
Right.
Yep. She'd lived with Mordecai. The people might be different, but guys are guys.
Guys are guys, right.
And she probably saw what worked, what didn't, but she knew how. And I don't want to say she was being she wasn't being evilly manipulative, but she understood that what she was going to ask was something that could backfire on her. It's not just something that he could simply say no to. This is something that could really speed things up even for the negative, if not handled properly. So she really made sure her I's were dotted and her T's were crossed. So I'm going to make every effort I can to try to win these guys over every way I can.
I look at verse 2, Tim, in this light, and, seeing the different attitudes or the different responses of people. There are some people when they drink a lot of wine or alcohol, they become an ugly drunk. Or there's others who, when they drink a lot, they become a very merry drunk, a very silly and all this. And the queen must have known how the king normally responds to it. But certainly we find that this is the banquet of wine. So certainly they're keeping the goblets full for the king to drink and Haman to drink and so forth. So they have that. So the king asked her, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And I like that he calls her Queen Esther. It doesn't just say wife or honey or Esther or whatever. No, Queen Esther, right? And then he says the same thing to her that he had said previously.
2 times previously, even.
Right, yeah. So, you can have up to half the kingdom.
Yeah, which I find amazing because so many other ways we see this king interacting throughout this whole book is how wishy-washy he can be.
Right.
He's always seeking everybody else for counsel and for guidance, and he does do that a little bit here again in this book, not asking direct guidance, but gets some and responds. But it seemed like when it came down to this, he was very decisive.
Yeah, and, I
and
think,
to the point that he said it, like I said, 3 different times. This was not a comment that was simply wine-induced.
yeah,
This was, not that wine probably didn't have its effect in it, but it was something that he has stayed true to throughout this whole discussion.
right. And I think just the response or the words used here, it shall be performed. I've already made up my mind. Anything you want up to half the kingdom is yours. It's already, basically I've said it, I've granted it, it's yours, whatever you want. So it will be done. So, and then Esther the queen, verse 3, answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight. And then once again, she goes, and if, I oftentimes change the word if to because, because I think it means the same. So we can read it, because I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. Now she's going to lay this heavy thing on him. At this point, I don't think he has a clue what's going on.
Well, he doesn't. I mean, we see that throughout, and how that mere statement alone must have caused his mouth to drop open and his eyeballs to bug out of his head.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you mean?
Yeah,
that your petition is to grant me my life.
Yeah.
It's like, I've told you I want to give you half the kingdom. What do you mean give you your life and your and spare your people? Who gives with all this? Yeah, who are they? Because again, up until this point, it's just all he knows is there was a people that were being given this request, but he didn't have any say as far as how it was going to be drawn up. He gave Haman all that right to make those determinations. So now all of a sudden, hold it. You've got my attention. I mean, you had my attention before, but now you've really got my attention. Right. Who is trying to harm this one that I'm willing to give half the kingdom to? So his dander's already starting to brew before he even hears Haman's name attached.
Yeah. And once again, remember now, the king is still oblivious of Esther's nationality. Now, Haman knows it because of, or at least he knows of Mordecai's. Now, whether or not he knows of Esther's nationality at this point,
I don't know that
I
he does.
don't know whether he does or not. But now Esther is confirming, though, I'm the same nationality as my uncle. Mordecai. So goes and says, O king, if it please the king, or because it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we are sold, and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. So here I think she's giving him a little picture of who she is. Well, who did we conquer? Who did we bring as our slaves? Who did we bring? Oh, the Jews. So now she's starting to let the cat out of the bag, who she really is, what nationality she is, because she goes and says, for we are sold, and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Sold. Is she talking about Haman? That the Haman paid a price to the king, right? To have this petition written up. So is that what she's making reference to? That Haman had paid a price for me and my kinsmen? Because we've been sold.
Been sold for destruction and slaughter, yeah. And so you see her just vaguely peeling off the layers of the onion.
Yep.
little by little, letting the king kind of, letting it sink in. It's almost like, when a hard rain comes and you've got cracked soil, it doesn't penetrate. But if you sprinkle it, it softens the soil. And then when the downpour comes, it's able to receive it. And so you almost see this approach of her taking it. It's like, okay, we're going to be annihilated. Pretty bold statement. But now she begins to paint a picture. Someone's been sold. Okay, when did money exchange hands? And he's now beginning to come to his own conclusions. Who's been sold for destruction recently? So by the time she actually mentions, he's already kind of got that idea already in his head. It's just now she's attached a word to it. He's like, yeah, that's right. I now remember all this. Because this would have been, again, like I said, almost a year has gone by to this point. Because we're coming up on that time frame when the slaughter is going to happen. Long time from the first month to the 12th. So she's reminding him, bringing him back to remember when. So,
this reminds me of my father used to tell me. He was a real estate salesman and so forth, and things. And he used to tell me the best way to make a sale is to make them think it's their idea.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that exactly what Esther's doing?
It is.
I mean, she's really selling this, making the king think, aha. Now I know. And
I'm not okay with people being sold. It's not like she's trying to tell me this is what I want. She could have just blurted it out, but she didn't. She's laying it out to in such a way that any king in his right mind would be able to look at and say, yes, my judgment is, I'm not now doing this just because you want it. I see the reason to do it.
And another thing that I think she does so masterfully in verse 4 is she lays out, look, this is going to take my life. It's not as if we've been sold just as slaves. If we'd been sold just as slaves, I wouldn't have said a word. Why? Because that's who they are.
And, but then again, though, she even plays again onto that male ego aspect. That if it had merely been sold male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet. Why? Because no such distress would justify disturbing the king.
Right.
So she keeps him elevated, as opposed to Vashti.
Right. Yeah. And
where the king makes a request and she simply says, no, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
But all the way through this, from the very first words, if it pleases the king, all the way to this end, had it been anything less than this, I wouldn't have bothered you because of who you are. And it wasn't that she was being evilly manipulative here, but she also understood, look, I'm respecting, I understand your role. And so what I'm asking of you, I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't such a big deal.
And if, I think this is the place where we really need to interject, even though God has not been mentioned. Who is directing Esther in all of this?
Right.
I just cannot comprehend in my mind that Esther, as a young woman, and she's still a very young woman at this point, but maybe she's in her early 20s. Would she know within herself how to do this? I don't think so.
Right.
But I do think that because she went to prayer and fasting for those 3 days, and because she had requested it of Mordecai to do it, and because she had, bowed before the Lord in this, even though it's not mentioned, it's pictured, God now is directing her and saying, this is how you're going to do it. This is what, you open your mouth and I'll speak through you. And how often, I'm sure you and I as pastors have had this happen, that, we'd come into a situation and we'd kind of like, how am I to answer this? And the next thing you know, either the scripture verse comes to mind or the answer comes to mind and say, wow, that had to have been a God thing, that he put those words in my mouth to share them with you.
And not just that, but the factor of how she was able to respond. Again, as we said, this is a second party where there's only 3 people present, herself, the king, and Haman. The very one who she knows is personally responsible and will be responsible for her annihilation, her uncle's annihilation, and all of her people's annihilation, is sitting at my table.
Yep.
Not just once, but 2 consecutive days. The kind of strength and peace that God had to have given her
Yeah.
to be able to not come across as being bothered or vengeful or hateful or any of those things, which I think is the power, again, of the fasting.
Yeah.
Because I think without the fasting, could she have done that? Probably not.
Yeah.
You know, that would have been a very, very difficult thing to do, especially when you see the way that she refers to him, when she calls him this vile Haman.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden now she lets it all be known exactly what she thinks of this man and what's at the very depths of the heart of who he is.
I find it interesting that all through this, she does not mention who the enemy is yet.
Right.
You know, where oftentimes it would be easy for us to blot out the name of the person right off the get-go. But she doesn't. She holds it in and holds it in and holds it in until the king asks her,
Yeah.
who is he?
Yeah. Because by that point, when he asked the question, he has opened himself up.
Yeah.
Until that point, had she thrown out his name,
Yeah.
it probably wouldn't have been heard at the same level. But because she waited until he asked the question, he's willing to say, I want to know who this is, no matter who it is, you tell me.
Yeah.
I am inviting you now
Yeah.
to enlighten me. I am here with all ears open. So let me have it.
Yeah.
And as I said, that's when she lets it out.
You know, and we see this, that, you know, she doesn't give out any information until the king asks for it. You know, because would he have heard it if she had done it before?
Right.
Probably not in the same vein that he hears it now, because now his anger is boiling up inside of him. What? Somebody wants to kill my queen? Somebody wants to kill my queen's people? Who is this man? Where is he? And I love that. Where is he? You know, in verse 5, that does perform in his heart to do so. So he knows that it's not just a head thing. It's a hatred that is brewed up in the guy's heart, in Haman's heart. And it's been something that's been brewing for an awful long time. Because remember, the Jews and the Agagites have never been friends. So I'm sure Haman has heard stories about how the Jews had come and done this to his people and all of this. So you got this hatred that has been brewing and brewing and brewing, and now Haman's going to get revenge on this. So the king arising, wait a minute, verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy. And I like the way she puts that. He's the one whom we are going against, but he's the enemy. He's the worst of the worst. You know, the adversary and the enemy is this, and I love the way you have vile, I think, in yours.
Yeah.
I have wicked Haman.
Yeah.
So she goes and she describes him to a T. No, this is not just somebody king, because the king thought Haman was a great guy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the king brought him up in the ranks and confided in him and had him as second in command and all of this stuff. The king was absolutely oblivious of how hateful and wicked this man was. So Esther had to go and show him he is a wicked man.
Yeah. And by keeping the person detached from the situation until the last moment, allowed the king that ability to look at it more objectively. To understand that, okay, no matter who this is, given these circumstances, anybody would be punishable by this, all emotions aside.
Yeah.
And so that's good. And again, the fact that she worded it like that, the adversary and the enemy, I'm placing myself in that situation thinking, okay, here's the king who's referring to her, like you said so wonderfully, Queen Esther.
Yeah.
And now she lays out the case for her people, but at the same time, she's speaking not just as a Jew, she's speaking as queen. So now this isn't just an adversary and an enemy of the Jewish people, it's an adversary and an enemy
And mine.
of mine.
Right.
And so all of a sudden now you see a real bridge being built. This isn't just against one people, this is against the whole country, really.
You know, and I see in the end of verse 6, to me, this is a beautiful picture. Here's now Esther telling the king who this adversary, this enemy is. And all of it, I wish I could have been there to see Haman's face.
Mm.
The last thing in the world he ever expected.
Yeah.
Once again, he expected praise, he expected promotion, he expected everything.
Yeah.
And to have this little 20-some-year-old young woman, face off with Haman.
And pronounce sentence.
And I just can't help but think that by this time, Esther is not only speaking, it is Haman, him, like they're pointing at him, so that the king would see the anger and the disdain and everything that Esther is feeling for this man. And here's Haman saying, "Who, me?"
Yeah. It's like, what has happened?
Me? Yeah, what just hit me? Did you get the number of that plate that just, the truck that just ran over me? What just hit me here?
Right.
And we find that at the end of verse 6. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. So now we find that the king is really upset. He gets up from the banquet table, verse 7. He arrives from the banquet wine in his wrath, and he went into the palace garden. And we started with this. Why did he rise up? Why did he go into the palace garden? Do you think it's because the king needed to collect his thoughts and say, wait a minute, here's a man I confided in. Here's a man that I kind of was prepping maybe to be the next king or whatever. And have I been such a fool? He had to kind of collect his thoughts. I know that there's been times that I've had to get up from a meeting and go take a walk because, man, I got to collect my thoughts so I don't say something stupid, don't do something stupid. But I just want to, what am I to do? How am I to respond to this? And that's what it appears to me in verse 7 that the king is doing. Getting up and instead of just pronouncing sentence immediately, wait a minute, I got to think this out. Now, let's stop here for a minute. This is the first time, I think, that we have seen in 7 chapters that the king ever thought anything out.
Right.
He really didn't. Haman goes and says, I want to write this decree. Oh, sure, go write it. Here's my ring. Put the insignia thing on it and done. I don't care what you write or whatever. He was so blasé about everything. But here, you don't find him being that.
And in addition to his rage, I can only imagine, and we only mentioned the rage here, but I can imagine part of why he got up was just the confused plethora of emotions that he was feeling at this moment. Here's a man that he would go as far as say, yeah, whatever you want to do. If there's a people rising up, yeah, go ahead. To have that kind of trust, that kind of faith in someone, to all of a sudden at this moment, have all that crushed. And this had not just been a recent thing. This had been over a number of years that he had built, that Haman had this level of relationship with the king. And now for the king to find out, has this all been a lie? What have I done all this time? Who have I been putting my trust and my faith in here? What's going on? So you've got the anger that somebody would even do such a thing. So he's got that anger already. Now the anger is at him because of the betrayal that he has now done to the king, but then the king's own emotions about his own heart, of, man, what have I done? And I imagine all that stuff bombarded him such a level. There's a lot he had to sort through.
So, we're really looking at Haman. Haman's now at the point of saying, what just hit me? Well, isn't the king asking the same question? Haman had his knees cut out from underneath him, but so did the king. Esther has done a double whammy here on both men.
Yeah.
Because the king is saying, I never expected this.
Yeah.
I expected it to be maybe one of, the same kind of people that tried to assassinate me back a year ago.
Yeah.
But my own second in command wanting to do this.
But now how much more powerful does that also add the things that she has set up to this point? If it pleases the king.
Yep.
And I wouldn't bother you with things if it weren't as important because you are king.
Right.
And so there's no finger pointing going on here. Like, how dare you? How could you let this man be your second in command?
Yeah.
She really acknowledged him and she built him up. She encouraged him in his role. before dropping this bombshell. Almost to say that, look, this is what's going on, but you know what, King, you can handle this. You know, you are the one that will do what's right here.
So now we find Haman. The king has left the premises, gone out into the garden to think, maybe to go over the whole matter in his head and say, wow, what just hit me? Well, now you have Haman. He's taking on a completely different role because Haman stood up to make request for his life. Here's a man who thought he was a big deal. Now he's pleading, begging this young 20-something-year-old woman for his life. And, and I just can't help but picture it in my mind, as I think of Haman in his life. He's probably blubbering like a baby, thinking, oh no, and he's just performing that way to make requests for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So he knows when the king leaves, when he comes back, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And the only one that can save me is going to be Queen Esther.
Yeah.
So he's requesting, he's begging. I find the word request to me mean he's really begging, not just simply asking, well, Queen Esther, I'm sorry. And no, there was none of that going on. He was pleading his life.
Yeah. Well, he knew this was his last chance.
Yeah.
Because the way mine worded it was that when the king had left in a rage, that said Haman realizing that the king had already decided. So before the king even walked out of the building, he already knew, I'm dead.
Yeah.
So if, I've got absolutely no way to get through to him. My only possible hope is if I get through to her.
Right.
So I've got to somehow throw myself on the mercy of the court here while he's out of the room.
Yeah. So can I change Esther's heart by pleading to her, begging, for my life? So what happens? The king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. So the king now is coming back in, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was reclining. Now, so just a picture of Haman now laying there in the same bed where Queen Esther is, and the thoughts that is going through the king's mind. This is what this scoundrel has done, how he has cheated, how he has lied, how he has manipulated, how he's done this. And now the thing that puts it over the top.
And we don't know how he was pleading for his life. All we have to go on is what we know of him up until this point. And I don't know about you, but I don't think this was necessarily a humble pleading, because this guy was as far as removed from humility as you could possibly get. When it gets to a point where only one man out of a whole kingdom doesn't bow, and you're willing to have a whole people annihilated because of that one man. That level of pride, even being called on his stuff, I don't think this was a sign of repentance in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
It was another way. I think that Haman was probably doing what Haman knew how to do. Manipulate.
Maybe bribing.
So in his pleading, was it more of a bribe? Was it more of a, look, these are the things that I've been given, and if we can somehow make amends here. And I don't know if he was making sexual advances as a possible way of trying to do that, but from what I've seen of his character up until this point, I wouldn't put that past him.
Right.
I'm not going to say he did, because I'd be reading into what's not there, but but that would be very much in fitting with his character. And the fact, as you said, just thinking of the position, some say couch, some say bed, but the mere fact that she is reclining in some way on this, and he, a man who is supposedly at fear for his life, is not before the presence of a queen on his knees, on his face before her, trying to plead his case, but rather is on the same piece of furniture, reclining. That doesn't sound much like a position of humility and repentance. That sounds more of a place of manipulation to me.
Another thing that it just hit me. Here's Esther, once again, a very young queen, maybe in her 20s. Very young queen. But she appears very comfortable in her position. I think she appears very relaxed, knowing that God was going to take care of this. God had it all under control. You don't see her quivering. You don't see her crying and bawling. You don't see her doing the things that a nervous person would do or whatever. No, she's reclined, you know. So it's almost like, you know, God gave her that peace that passes all understanding that we read about so often, you know, because she's just very comfortable in who she is and you know, her position. I just, you know, and I just look at that and I say, wow, this is neat. So Haman has fallen upon the bed where Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? To me, that implies what the king was thinking, that he's trying to force himself or seduce the queen.
Yeah. Well, my translation actually uses the word molest.
Molest, okay.
Yep.
So we have that. So as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. What covered Haman's face? It's almost as if, it's almost like he punched him in the face with the words. Yeah, is how I read that. And they covered Haman's face. And now you have Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, oh, behold, there just happens to be a gallows out there. Guess what? You know, and he made it for Mordecai. And he was going to hang Mordecai, who spoken good for the king. Oh, he remembered. He said, remember now, this is the Mordecai that you have not rewarded yet. You know, and he wanted to do away with him. So that he did good for the king, standing in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Whew. I did it. It's done. Now let's move on.
I didn't have to request what I should do from all my other counselors. The eunuch simply made a mention of, you know, because he obviously saw that the king's anger was like, I got to do something here, and he just threw an idea out there. It's like, yep, that's the perfect answer here. Never a question of what should I do. Right. It was just like, oh yeah, that's a good answer.
And it's really kind of neat that Harbona was right there. And well, if it pleased the king, could I make a suggestion? You know, and told him about the gallows and everything else, and the king said, good idea, you know, hang him. And therefore, he hanged him. Next week, we'll get into chapter 8 and go a little further, find out about Haman's family and all of that stuff, and see what else God has for us. I'm Pastor Harold Noyes, pastor of the Community Christian Church. We're located on the Lower Road in Athens, Vermont. We have morning worship at 9:30 every Sunday morning. We also have an evening service that is at 6 p.m., right there in our sanctuary on the Lower Road in Athens. We'd love to have you come out and join us.
And if you're in the Charlestown, New Hampshire area, our meeting is Life on Main at the Charlestown Senior Center at 223 Old Springfield Road. Invite you to come on out and join us. Our service is at 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and we also have a coffee hour at 10 o'clock. We also have Bible study or a prayer meeting on Wednesday nights at 6:30 at our house at 276 Main Street, right there in Charlestown as well. You're invited to come on out and join us as we pray for our community there as well. Of course, want to thank Fact TV for making this show possible. And you can find us on their website, fact8.org, as well as on a lot of social media sites. You can find Heartline Ministries listed there on Facebook, on Rumble, YouTube, and Truth Social. And you can also find us on your favorite podcast providers, and apparently some people out there listen to one called Podvine. So we are now on Podvine's podcast platform as well.
Wow, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to Heartline Ministry.